My parents always said, family comes first. What they really meant was, you come last. From the moment I was old enough to carry a laundry basket, I was their unpaid maid. While my siblings went to birthday parties and summer camps, I was scrubbing dishes, folding clothes, and ironing shirts for a father who never said thank you, and a mother who told me I should be grateful for a roof over my head. For years I believed them. I told myself sacrifice was love, that maybe one day they would notice. But then it happened. A CEO worth millions leaned across a glossy conference table, signed his name next to mine, and said words that silenced every insult I'd ever swallowed. This $4 million contract, she made it happen. That single moment flipped my world upside down, and for the first time I realized I was never the maid. I was the storm they never saw coming. The house I grew up in always smelled of bleach and cheap cooking oil, because that was my job, to keep it spotless and make whatever meals were demanded. There was no space that actually felt like mine. My room was the size of a storage closet, with mismatched sheets and a broken dresser, while my older brother's room had a flat-screen TV, air conditioner, and new carpet. My mother said he deserved it because he was the golden child, who would make something of himself, while I was lucky to be allowed to live under their roof. It didn't matter that I was the one who ironed his shirts before his dates, cooked his favorite pasta, or even cleaned the vomit from the bathroom after his drunken nights. When my sister came along, she was treated like a fragile princess, her whims indulged while I picked up after her. If she spilled juice on the carpet, I was screamed at for not being careful. If she broke something, I was blamed for not watching her closely enough. I can still hear my father's voice booming through the walls. "Get in here now! Clean this up, don't just stand there like you're useless." I was 12. 12 years old, carrying garbage bags out in the middle of the night because he didn't want to see them in the morning. I used to imagine neighbors peeking through their curtains, wondering why that skinny little girl was out on the curb dragging black trash bags bigger than her. But nobody ever said a word. At school, I wore the same 2 faded pairs of jeans over and over. My classmates noticed. Some laughed, others avoided me, but not a single teacher asked if everything was okay. And at home, my parents always had the same excuse. We can't afford more. That line became their shield. Except somehow they always had money for my brother's soccer trips, for my sister's ballet costumes, for new furniture in the living room when relatives were coming over. For me? Nothing but secondhand leftovers. I told myself to swallow it, to push harder, to study late at night when everyone else was asleep. Sometimes I would sit on the cold kitchen floor, textbooks open on my lap, while the washing machine rattled beside me and the smell of bleach burned my nose. That was my childhood. Not warmth, not laughter, just a constant reminder that I was useful only when I was cleaning, cooking, or silent. And the worst part? I believed that was my place. Until the first crack appeared in their perfect facade. A moment that would change everything. Though at the time I was too tired to even notice. As I got older, the work didn't lessen. It grew heavier because they saw me as free labor. By the time I was 16, I was waking up before dawn to cook breakfast for everyone, packing my brother's lunch, ironing my father's shirts, brushing my sister's hair, and then rushing out the door to make it to school on time. If I dared to leave one task undone, the yelling would start. Sometimes objects thrown across the kitchen. Sometimes hours of silent treatment that felt even worse. My mother would hiss at me, "Do you think you're special? Without us, you'd have nothing. You'll always need us." She wanted me small, dependent, easy to control. What she didn't know was that in those stolen hours, when I was exhausted and should have been asleep, I was teaching myself skills they never thought I deserved. At first, it was just a borrowed library computer, slow and old, where I stumbled into a free online course about marketing. I clicked through lessons at night, hiding the glow of the screen under my blanket. While they thought I was just their maid, I was quietly building knowledge, word by word, strategy by strategy. I didn't tell anyone. Not my friends. Not even the one teacher who once whispered, "You're brighter than they know." I kept my secret, because in that house, any spark of ambition was stomped out immediately. I remember once I mentioned wanting to apply for a summer program at a local college. My father laughed so hard he nearly spit out his beer. You? College? Who's gonna cook if you're off pretending you're someone? Forget it. My mother backed him up with that cutting look of hers, the one that made me feel invisible. And yet deep down, their cruelty became fuel. Every slammed door, every insult carved into me like a reminder, prove them wrong. By 18, when most of my classmates were celebrating graduation with parties, I was working part-time jobs no one else wanted, cleaning offices late at night, stocking shelves at dawn just to save a few crumpled bills at a time. And when my parents found out I was saving money, they didn't clap or say they were proud. They demanded it. "You live here, you owe us rent," my father declared, snatching half my paycheck before I could even hide it. I cried in silence that night, realizing my own family saw me not as a daughter but as a servant they could exploit forever. But I also realized something else. The only way out was to build something they couldn't touch. Something so undeniable even they would be forced to see me differently. That's when I found my first client, a small online boutique run by a woman in another state. She couldn't afford an agency, so she took a chance on me, the girl who worked by candlelight while her family slept. I built her a campaign that tripled her sales in 2 months, and when she wired me my first real payment, I stared at the screen for hours, my heart pounding. It wasn't much compared to the millions I would one day handle, but in that moment it felt like freedom, like proof that I was not the maid they'd made me out to be. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the tiny kitchen table, the one where I'd scrubbed stains for years, and I whispered to myself, "This is the beginning." I had no idea just how right I was, or how far those late nights and stolen moments would take me. The more I worked, the more I learned. And within a year, I had built a small roster of clients who trusted me because I delivered. I wasn't just dabbling. I was building something real, something that gave me the power to finally imagine a life beyond my parents' walls. I still lived in that suffocating house because I couldn't afford to move yet, but I started to taste independence. I had my own bank account, carefully hidden, with a password no one else could guess. I had emails from business owners thanking me for doubling their sales. I even got invited to join a small networking group online where people treated me as an equal, not as a servant. For the first time, I felt respected. And that respect was like oxygen. But oxygen makes fire burn brighter, and my parents noticed the glow. At first, it was little comments. My mother saying, "Don't forget where you came from," every time I bought myself something as small as a new pair of shoes. My father scoffing when I came home late from a client call, demanding to know why I thought my time was more important than his. The moment that still burns in my memory is when I got my first contract worth 5 figures. $10,000. I should have been celebrating. Instead, my father demanded to see the agreement, and when I hesitated, he slapped the table so hard the dishes rattled. "We're your family," he barked. "You don't hide things from us. You live under this roof. Everything you earn belongs to this household." I was shaking, but I refused to hand it over. That night he didn't speak to me, and my mother glared at me like I'd betrayed them. The next morning, my brother had a brand new gaming console, and my sister pranced around in a designer dress. Both bought with family money, which I knew meant my parents had gone behind my back and tried to access my account. They couldn't. Thank God I'd set up 2-step verification. But it was the first time I realized they were actively plotting to take what I earned. I started noticing things. My father hovering near my laptop when I left the room. My mother asking oddly specific questions about my clients. Even my sister casually mentioning she overheard them whispering about how all her money should come to us. After all, we raised her. They weren't proud of me. They were waiting for their chance to strip me bare. I kept quiet, but inside I was planning, learning, growing stronger. My chance came faster than I expected. One of my boutique campaigns caught the attention of a mid-size company, and they asked me to pitch for a contract that could change everything. It wasn't millions yet, but it was the kind of deal that could put me on the map. The night before my presentation, my father stormed into my room unannounced, demanding to know where I was going in the morning. When I told him, his eyes narrowed. "Don't embarrass us," he snapped. "If you get this money, you'd better remember who you owe." That was the moment I knew the truth. They weren't my supporters. They were vultures circling, waiting for me to succeed just enough so they could swoop in and feast. And the terrifying part? I could already see how far they were willing to go to keep me in the role of their maid, no matter how much I achieved. The day of that pitch, I wore the only blazer I owned, a cheap second-hand one I had altered myself with a needle and thread at 2 a.m. My laptop was charged, my slides were rehearsed, and I felt a quiet determination I had never felt before. But when I reached into my bag at the conference table, my stomach dropped. My flash drive with the entire presentation was gone. I knew instantly who had touched my things. No one else had access to my room. No one else even cared enough to dig through my bag. My father had stood in the doorway the night before with that smug smirk, and now I realized it wasn't just intimidation, it was sabotage. I held my breath, prayed to every god I didn't believe in, and opened my email. I had backed everything up to the cloud, something he didn't even know existed. Within minutes, my slides were glowing on the screen, and I delivered the pitch with my heart pounding so hard I thought the executives could hear it. 2 weeks later, the email came through. Contract awarded, 6 figures, a game changer. I sat at that same kitchen table where I'd once scrubbed stains, staring at the number $120,000 on the screen. My hands shook as I realized this wasn't just survival money, this was escape money. But before I could even process it, my mother appeared behind me, silent like a shadow. She leaned over my shoulder, saw the email, and her eyes gleamed with a hunger that made me nauseous. "So," she whispered, "we'll finally be comfortable." I turned to her, my voice cold. "No, I will finally be comfortable." That was the beginning of war. The very next day, my father confronted me with a printed check that wasn't his. He had intercepted the mail, ripped open an envelope addressed to me, and stood there waving it like a victory flag. "What kind of daughter hides money from her parents?" he roared. "Do you think you're better than us?" I snatched it from his hand before he could crumple it, and for the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. "This is mine," I said, my voice steady even as my knees shook. That night, they unleashed every weapon they had. My brother called me selfish, my sister cried fake tears about how I was ruining the family, and my mother slammed doors until the walls shook. But I didn't back down. I locked my laptop, set stronger passwords, even stored client documents on a separate hard drive I hid in my backpack and carried everywhere. Still, the attacks kept coming. Once I found my father on the phone pretending to be me, trying to charm information out of a client. Another time I caught my mother rifling through my desk drawers, muttering about how I owed them everything. Every success I achieved became a new reason for them to tighten their grip, and every time they failed to break me, their anger grew darker. It was like living in enemy territory, under siege in my own home. But what they didn't realize was that with every attempt to crush me, they were teaching me exactly how strong I was. And when the moment came, when a CEO worth millions shook my hand and said my name in a room full of witnesses, it would be too late for them to stop me. The night I made my decision was quiet, almost too quiet. My father had gone to bed early after drinking. My mother was locked in her room and my siblings were out. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers I had printed in secret. Contracts, receipts, emails, even screenshots with timestamps. Proof that every cent I had earned was mine, not theirs. I organized them into a neat folder and slipped it into my bag, because I knew the next move would not be in this house. It would be in an office where their screams couldn't reach me. The next morning, I walked into a bank and opened an entirely new account under a different institution, transferring every dollar I could before they had a chance to sniff it out. Then I contacted a lawyer, one recommended quietly by a client who understood toxic families better than anyone. He listened as I explained years of exploitation, how they had tried to impersonate me, how they had intercepted my mail. He didn't laugh, he didn't doubt me, he simply said, "Document everything, every word, every action." And I did. When my father cornered me that night demanding I hand over what belongs to the family, I clicked record on my phone in my pocket and let him rant, capturing every threat, every admission. "We made you! You owe us!" he growled, and I kept my face calm while my stomach churned. My mother joined in, shrieking that I was a thief, that I was nothing without them. I didn't yell back. I didn't cry. I just said one line that froze them both. "This conversation is being documented." For the first time, my father's voice cracked. He tried to laugh it off, but his eyes darted to my phone, and he knew the game had changed. Over the next weeks, the pressure escalated. They accused me of betrayal in front of relatives, spreading stories that I was unstable, ungrateful, cruel. But every word they threw at me only gave me more clarity. I began to separate myself piece by piece. New accounts, new clients, even a co-working space where I could meet professionals who saw me not as a servant, but as a strategist. The moment that sealed my resolve came when my mother attempted to cash a fraudulent check in my name. The bank flagged it and called me directly. I showed up with my folder of documents, every receipt, every text, and the branch manager looked at me with concern instead of suspicion. That was when I realized, for the first time, I had the power of proof on my side. That night, when my father tried to barge into my room again, I stood in the doorway and blocked him. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't crack. "We're not doing this anymore," I said. His face turned red, his fist clenched, but he didn't step forward. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of me, but fear of losing control. And that was the exact moment I knew I had crossed a line I could never step back from. The gossip started before I even realized how far they were willing to go. My aunt called one afternoon, voice dripping with false sympathy, asking if it was true that I had stolen money from my own parents. I nearly laughed, but my throat was too tight. They had spread it. My parents had poisoned the family tree with lies. Suddenly, cousins stopped replying to my texts. Relatives who used to beg me for favors now sent passive-aggressive messages about how a daughter should never forget where she comes from. My mother even staged a scene at a cousin's birthday party, crying loud enough for the whole room to hear, claiming I had abandoned them after all their sacrifices. I stood there, holding a paper plate of cake I no longer wanted, listening as whispers filled the space, every eye turning toward me. And then, instead of shrinking like I used to, I straightened my shoulders and said clearly, "I don't owe anyone my freedom." The room fell silent. My mother's face crumpled in fury, but I didn't care. I left the cake untouched on the table and walked out. They thought public humiliation would break me. They didn't realize it only made me stronger. That night, I drafted an email to every client I had, attaching my portfolio, testimonials, even copies of forged documents my parents had tried to pass off as mine. I explained, without bitterness but with clarity, that if anyone received strange communication in my name, it was fraud. The responses poured in: support, reassurance, even offers to connect me with legal teams if I needed them. One CEO wrote, "You're smarter than most seasoned consultants I've worked with. Don't let anyone dim that." I sat there staring at the words, realizing strangers valued me more than my own blood ever had. My father tried a different tactic next. He barged into my room one morning waving a stack of unpaid bills, claiming I was destroying the household by keeping money to myself. "I recorded every second. If you don't step up, we'll lose this house," he shouted, spit flying. I calmly replied, "Maybe if you stopped drinking 3 nights a week, you could afford your own bills." His face turned a dangerous shade of red, but I didn't flinch. I saved the recording to 3 different drives, labeled, dated, secured. My mother switched tactics, too. She tried the guilt card, leaving notes on my pillow. "Remember who fed you. Remember who raised you. Remember you're nothing without us." I kept them all, filed away like evidence in a case that was slowly building itself. And when my brother, the golden child, sneered that, "No one will ever celebrate you, you're just a maid with a laptop," I didn't respond. I just thought of the day I would stand in a boardroom with my name printed on a multi-million-dollar contract while he sat in the same living room, still begging for handouts. Every attempt to break me only clarified the truth. Their power over me was slipping, and mine was growing. The first real consequence hit them harder than I expected. A letter arrived from the bank, addressed to me but opened by my father, his hands shaking as he read it out loud. It stated that an investigation had been triggered after someone attempted to forge my signature on a withdrawal slip. The bank had flagged suspicious activity, and the case had been escalated. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized they weren't untouchable anymore. He tried to laugh it off, muttering that it must have been a clerical mistake, but I could see the sweat on his forehead. My mother cornered me that night, her voice trembling as she begged me to clear this up, insisting that families should protect each other. I simply looked her in the eye and said, "Protecting family doesn't mean letting them rob you." She slapped me then, the sting sharp across my cheek, but I didn't cry. I took a photo of the mark, logged it, and sent it directly to my lawyer with a timestamp. From that moment, every interaction became evidence. Every threat, every note, every overheard phone call, I stored it all. When they tried to spread more lies to relatives, I quietly forwarded screenshots of bank emails, fraudulent attempts, and voice recordings. Suddenly, the whispers died down. Cousins who had ignored me began sending apologies, some even cutting ties with my parents. For the first time, the narrative wasn't theirs to control. It was mine. My father doubled down, calling me in the middle of the night, shouting that I was destroying the family's reputation. I didn't argue. I let the voicemail record every word, every drunken slur, every admission that he had opened mail that wasn't his. My lawyer told me to keep stacking it up, and I did. By then, I was no longer just surviving. I was preparing for war in broad daylight. Neighbors began to notice, too. One morning, as I left for a client meeting, Mrs. Alvarez from next door whispered, "I heard yelling last night. Are you okay?" For the first time, instead of brushing it off, I smiled faintly and said, "I'm better than okay. You'll see soon enough." That week, the contract that would change everything landed in my inbox. A multi-million-dollar deal, the kind of partnership that CEOs fought over. My name was printed bold at the top of the agreement. I stared at the number, $4,000, and knew my life had officially crossed into a territory my family could never follow. They sensed it too. My mother rifled through my trash, looking for clues, and my father hovered at the door every time I took a call. But it was too late. The walls they had built around me for years were cracking. And this time I wasn't just stepping through the cracks, I was tearing them down piece by piece with signatures, contracts, and witnesses who mattered. The week before the contract was finalized, my parents made their most desperate move yet. I came home one evening to find my laptop missing from my desk. Panic rose in my chest, but instead of screaming, I searched calmly, knowing exactly where to look. Sure enough, my father was in the living room, the device open on his lap, fumbling through files he didn't even understand. "This all belongs to the family," he barked as I stormed in. I didn't argue. I simply pulled out my phone and snapped a photo of him holding stolen property. He lunged forward, trying to grab it, but I slipped the phone into my pocket. "You just committed theft," I said quietly. For the first time, silence filled the room. My mother tried to cover for him, insisting he was only checking on me, but her voice shook. I took the laptop, restored my encrypted files, and that night moved everything critical to a secure cloud server. The following morning, I met with the company's executives in a boardroom that gleamed with glass and steel. The CEO himself sat at the head of the table, a man whose name carried weight in the industry. I presented my strategy with steady confidence, every slide a culmination of sleepless nights and quiet determination. When I finished, there was a pause, then slow, deliberate applause. The CEO leaned forward, his voice carrying across the room. "This is the most solid proposal we've seen. You've just secured a $4 million contract." The room erupted in claps, and my name was spoken with respect, not scorn. I felt something inside me shift forever. At that exact moment, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. "Come home now." "We need to talk." I didn't reply. Instead, I slipped the phone back into my bag and shook the CEO's hand. His grip firm, his smile genuine. He added words that echoed in my head long after. "You're going places. Don't let anyone hold you back." Walking out of that building felt like stepping into a new life. But I knew the storm at home was waiting. When I finally returned, my parents were seated at the kitchen table, faces grim. My father shoved a printed article toward me. News of the contract had already spread in industry circles. "You will give us control of this," he growled. "You owe us everything." I picked up the paper, studied it for a moment, then folded it neatly. My voice was calm, even detached, when I said, "No, what I owe you ended years ago." His fist slammed the table. My mother wailed. My siblings shouted. But for the first time, their noise didn't touch me, because I had already won. The night after the contract was announced, the house turned into a battlefield. My father paced the living room like a caged animal, veins bulging in his forehead while my mother clutched her phone, calling relatives one after another to paint me as the traitor who had abandoned her blood. My brother tried to act like the enforcer, blocking the front door and sneering, "You can't just walk out on us now. $4 million belongs to all of us." I didn't even look at him. Instead, I set my bag on the table, pulled out a crisp folder, and spread out the documents inside. Signed contracts, bank statements, lawyer letters. I pointed to each page with steady hands and said, "Every cent is legally mine. Every attempt you've made to touch it is documented, recorded, and could be prosecuted." My father roared, grabbed the folder, but froze when he saw the lawyer's seal stamped in blue ink. He wasn't dealing with a scared girl anymore. He was dealing with someone protected, someone untouchable. My mother broke then, her voice cracking as she begged, "But we raised you. We fed you. Doesn't that mean anything?" I looked her in the eyes and replied, "It means you had the chance to love me, and you chose to use me instead." The words hit harder than any scream, and she slumped into her chair, whispering to herself like she couldn't understand how the control had slipped away. My siblings exchanged a glance, and for once, even they looked uncertain, like maybe the golden child and the princess had finally realized the crown was fake. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder, and stood. "This house was your prison for me," I said quietly. "But it won't be my grave." I walked toward the door, and when my brother moved to block me again, I simply held up my phone, the screen glowing with a recording app still running. His face paled and he stepped aside. I left them in silence, their empire of intimidation crumbling behind me. And as I stepped into the night air, I felt the weight of decades lift from my shoulders. The next morning, I met my lawyer again. We filed formal notices, cease and desist letters, fraud reports, protective clauses on every cent tied to my contracts. My parents' names were nowhere in those papers. For the first time in my life, I had walls of my own, not built of fear, but of iron-bound legality they couldn't penetrate. And when the CEO invited me to a dinner celebrating the deal, I stood in a glittering room of polished marble and glass, his hand raised as he toasted. To her, the woman who just closed one of the biggest contracts this company has seen. My name echoed through the hall like an anthem. I smiled, glass in hand, and for the first time, I didn't think of bleach or garbage bags or slammed doors. I thought only of freedom. The backlash came swiftly, because people like my parents don't know how to quit. A week after my contract was signed, I received a notice that someone had tried to file a tax claim in my name, attempting to reroute a portion of my earnings. The fraud department flagged it immediately and forwarded me the details. My father's handwriting on a forged signature so sloppy it was almost pathetic. I forwarded it straight to my lawyer, who smiled coldly and said, "This will bury them." While he filed the necessary reports, I prepared myself for the storm brewing at home. Sure enough, my mother cornered me that evening, tears streaking her face as she wailed about family loyalty and how I was heartless to drag them through legal trouble. My father sat behind her, silent for once, his face pale and drawn, clutching a beer bottle he hadn't touched. My brother tried to sneer, but the edges of his bravado were crumbling too. and my sister stood off to the side, watching like a child who had just realized the castle she lived in was made of paper. I let them talk, let them spew guilt and lies, and when they finished, I simply laid a thin envelope on the table. Inside were copies of every fraudulent attempt, every recording, every note they had left me. Their eyes darted over the pages, and I saw the exact moment it hit them. They weren't in control anymore. They were trapped, exposed, powerless. My father slammed the envelope shut, his hand trembling, but he didn't look at me. My mother whispered, You wouldn't really take this to court." I leaned forward and said, "It's already there." The silence that followed was deafening. Days later, the fallout began. My father's employer called me after receiving inquiries from investigators, and within a week he lost his job. My mother's social circle evaporated when word spread that she and my father had been caught forging documents against their own daughter. My brother's college funding dried up overnight when my parents could no longer siphon money, and my sister, once the princess, found herself facing the reality of wearing the same shoes 2 years in a row. It wasn't me who destroyed them. It was their own greed finally catching up. Meanwhile, I was invited to speak at a corporate event where the CEO who had celebrated my contract introduced me to a room full of industry leaders. My name was printed on banners, my story whispered in corners, and for once, it wasn't as the family maid, but as a professional who had carved her own empire. The same week I moved out for good, into an apartment with tall windows and sunlight streaming across the hardwood floors. No bleach, no yelling, no locked doors, just peace. When my parents tried to call, I let it ring. When relatives asked why I cut ties, I forwarded them the documents and left it at that. I didn't need to scream. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. The final blow didn't come from me raising my voice. It came from the weight of paper and signatures that couldn't be argued with. My lawyer called one morning to tell me that charges of attempted fraud had been formally filed against my parents. The evidence I had been collecting for months was ironclad. Recordings, bank letters, forged documents, even the voicemails where my father drunkenly admitted to intercepting my mail. They were summoned to court, and suddenly the people who had strutted around the neighborhood bragging about their successful children were reduced to defendants in cheap suits. I sat quietly in the back of the courtroom as the judge reviewed the evidence, my folder laid out like a weapon on the prosecution's table. My mother cried, clutching tissues, insisting it was a misunderstanding, while my father tried to puff himself up and argue. But the judge cut him down with one sentence. "The evidence is overwhelming. This was deliberate fraud." The gavel hit wood, and with it, years of chains shattered around me. Outside, neighbors who once whispered rumors now stared at my parents with open disgust. Relatives who had believed their lies avoided their calls. My father's pride, the only currency he had left, evaporated in that courtroom. My mother, once so sharp with her words, avoided my eyes, knowing every insult she had hurled at me had been recorded and used against her. My brother and sister were quiet now, their arrogance gone, forced to reckon with the fact that the sister they had mocked as just the maid was the only one who had built something real. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I didn't even speak to them as I walked past. The sound of my heels clicking against the marble floor was enough. That same week, my story began to spread in the business world. Not the family drama, but the professional part. The girl who rose from nothing, who fought for her place, who secured a multi-million-dollar contract against all odds. The CEO who had celebrated me introduced me personally to new partners, and one night at a gala, standing under chandeliers, I realized I wasn't surviving anymore. I was thriving. The same hands that had scrubbed floors now shook the hands of millionaires, and the same girl who was treated like a servant was now a name on lips spoken with respect. And as for my parents, their house, once the center of my servitude, fell into disrepair when they couldn't afford upkeep. Their calls still came sometimes, begging, pleading, even threatening, but I never answered. Each missed call was its own form of justice, because the truth was undeniable now. I had escaped, I had risen, and I had done it without them. Freedom tasted strange at first. I would wake up in my new apartment to silence so complete it felt unreal. No footsteps stomping down the hallway. No shouts demanding I scrub something or cook breakfast. No accusations hanging in the air like smoke. Just sunlight streaming through tall windows and the hum of a city outside that didn't know my past. I bought myself real furniture piece by piece. A couch that was mine, dishes that no one else would dirty, a bed with sheets that smelled of lavender instead of bleach. Sometimes I caught myself cleaning obsessively out of habit, then stopped mid-motion and laughed because there was no one left to punish me if I didn't. Work flourished too. The contract I had secured with the CEO worth millions became a stepping stone, opening doors to projects I once thought untouchable. Soon I was flying to meetings in cities I had only seen in magazines, staying in hotels where the staff addressed me as Ms. instead of the maid. Every handshake reminded me I had earned my place, and every deal signed was another nail in the coffin of the identity my parents had tried to trap me in. Yet with success came ghosts. Late at night, I would sometimes hear my mother's voice in my head whispering, "You're nothing without us." I would sit up, heart racing until I remembered the courtroom, the contracts, the applause, the life I had built brick by brick. I wasn't nothing. I was more than they could ever comprehend. My parents tried again, of course. Letters arrived in the mail, written in shaky handwriting, asking for money, claiming they were sick, desperate, ruined. My lawyer advised me to ignore them, and I did. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. I knew the second I cracked that door open, they'd drag me back into servitude. My brother sent bitter messages online, accusing me of destroying the family. My sister posted cryptic photos captioned about betrayal, but none of it mattered. They were trapped in the web of their own making while I walked free outside of it. Sometimes, when I passed by their neighborhood on the way to a client, I saw the house. Paint peeling, grass overgrown, curtains drawn. A shell of the place that had once been my cage. I never stopped, never knocked, never even slowed down, because going back wasn't an option. The past was behind me, and the only direction left was forward. Sometimes I lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling of my apartment, and I wonder how different my life could have been if my parents had chosen love instead of control. I imagine a version of me who grew up hearing, "We're proud of you," instead of, "You owe us." A version who didn't have to sneak around with textbooks, who didn't have to hide her money, who didn't have to collect evidence against the very people who were supposed to protect her. That girl never existed. Instead, I became the one who learned to survive fire by walking straight through it. And though it burned, though it scarred, it also forged something unbreakable in me. My parents thought they had destroyed me by reducing me to a maid, but what they really did was sharpen me into steel. I think about my younger self, dragging trash bags heavier than my body out to the curb at midnight, and I wish I could whisper to her, "Hold on. One day you'll sign your name on a contract worth more than they ever dreamed of, and no one will be able to take it from you." But there is also grief. Grief for the family dinners that never felt safe, for the hugs that never came, for the simple joy of being a daughter that I will never know. People assume revenge is about rage, about screaming or striking back. But for me, it's been about clarity. Revenge was learning that I never needed their approval, only my own. Revenge was watching their empire of intimidation collapse under the weight of their own greed. Revenge was building a life so far beyond their reach that they could scream until their throats bled and still never touch me again. Sometimes I see women at conferences, women my age who smile easily when they mention their parents, who talk about family visits with warmth, and there's a small ache in my chest. But then those same women shake my hand, admire my work, and say, "I wish I had your strength." That's when I remember, this was the path I was given, and I walked it all the way to the end. My name is no longer whispered as gossip in a toxic household. It's printed on contracts, on invitations, on headlines in business magazines. And every time someone asks me how I did it, I smile softly and answer, I stopped being their maid and started being my own savior. Now my days no longer begin with shouted demands or end with slammed doors. They begin with coffee in a quiet kitchen that belongs entirely to me, with sunlight spilling over papers that carry my name, with emails from partners who see me as a leader and not a servant. My life has shifted in ways I couldn't have imagined when I was scrubbing floors at 12 years old. I travel for work now, standing in airports with my own suitcase, boarding flights that take me to cities where no one knows the version of me who used to hide bruises behind long sleeves. At conferences, CEOs shake my hand, introduce me as a powerhouse, a closer, a strategist worth millions. They don't know the ghosts that follow me, but they see the steel in my spine, the calm in my voice, and they respect it. Sometimes I sit in hotel rooms overlooking skylines and I let myself breathe, deeply and freely. And I remember what it felt like to choke on bleach fumes while kneeling on a bathroom floor. The contrast is so sharp it almost makes me dizzy. My parents still exist somewhere out there, in a house that crumbles a little more each year, surrounded by whispers of their downfall. They are ghosts in my story now, shadows without weight. They call sometimes, but I never answer. I don't need revenge in the form of their voices breaking through the phone. I already got my revenge the day I walked out with my head high. The day I proved that I was more than their maid. The day a CEO worth millions raised a glass to my success while they sat at home, waiting for a daughter who would never return. And in the silence of my new life, I've learned that revenge isn't loud. It's living well when they expected you to fall apart. It's owning every choice, every boundary, every breath that belongs only to me. And now, when I look in the mirror, I don't see the girl they tried to break. I see the woman who broke free. What about you? If you were in my place, would you have cut ties forever or given them one last chance?